Africa is being poisoned and nobody is talking about it. It's a continent being poisoned by something more silent and far more deadly.
GMOs, is there something to smile about?
Not at all. I wouldn't say there's anything good about GMOs.
The idea is we get rid of farmers, we kill any naturally grown food, and we engineer food in manufacturing plants and laboratories.
Your great-grandmother never had cancer. Think about that. She lived in a village, she had no hospital, no health insurance, no doctor on speed dial, and yet she lived fully into old age. Now look around you today.
Can GMO wipe out the human population? Like I said very few ago, if you did not skip it, is that GMOs have actually been introduced since the 1990s.
There was a time not that long ago when Africa fed the whole world. A time where Africa produced food systems so sophisticated that European explorers could not explain. A time where Africa produced good health foods that could survive conditions no laboratory engineered seed can replicate today. And then something changed overnight. Today, the continent that invented agriculture is importing it. We have reached a stage where we are importing food. Before we talk about what was taken, we must first understand what was there in the first place. Do you know that the indigenous farming techniques of the Yoruba, the Zulu, the Kikuyu, if I'm pronouncing that right, and the Shona people could sustain the entire kingdoms for centuries without a single drop of synthetic fertilizer? So picture this, your grandmother's kitchen. Think about what she grew, what she cooked. The smell of groundnut soup, ugali made from maize she harvested herself, jollof rice made with tomatoes from the backyard, fufu pounded from cassava dug from her own garden that morning. That food wasn't just food, it was identity, it was medicine, it was memory. Now think about what your children are eating today and ask yourself, how did we get here? The answer begins not in the 21st century, it begins in the 15th century with ships, chains, and soil that was never the same again. Most people understand colonialism as a political story. Empires drawing borders, installing governments, extracting minerals and labor. That's what a lot of people know. But colonialism was also a food story, and that chapter has never fully been told. The British, French, and the Portuguese colonizers did not just change who owned the land in Africa. They changed what grew in it, what grew in the continent. When European colonial powers arrived in Africa, they found a continent of extraordinary agricultural diversity, and their first order of business almost everywhere was to destroy what was there. The colonizers needed products they could ship back to European markets and sell for profit: cotton, rubber, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, groundnuts, tobacco. So they forced the African farmers through taxation, violence, and displacement to stop growing food for their families and start growing commodities for European factories. So here's the thing, entire communities that had grown their own food for thousands of years were suddenly forbidden from it or unable to, because the land was no longer theirs, because every hour of labor belonged to a colonial master. Because if you did not produce enough cotton or rubber, you did not eat. And in the Congo Free State, under King Leopold II of Belgium, if your village did not meet its rubber quota, they cut off your fingers, they cut off your children's fingers in front of you. But here's what they don't teach you in school today. The introduction of colonial cash crop agriculture did not just change what Africans grew. It destroyed the ecological intelligence that had thousands of years to develop. It replaced the communal farming with exploitative labor.
The impact of colonization affected all our lives.
I always say it's a deliberate act, I believe, to keep Africa in the dark.
It did reach a time where colonialism officially ended in Africa. The seeds that it planted in Africa's food system did not end. Get me right. In fact, in many ways, what came after colonialism was worse. Because at least under colonial rule, the chains were visible. You can see them. That, oh, look at African people, they are in chains. What came next was quieter, dressed in the language of development and aid and progress. They called it the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s is one of the most celebrated and most controversial events in modern agriculture. Here is what the Green Revolution brought to Africa. New seed varieties developed in laboratories in the United States and Europe. They wanted fast yields so that they can take those yields to the European markets. Now, the thing is impressive on paper. At the end of the day, they wanted profit quick. They needed seeds that produce yields very quick. But these seeds had a secret. They were not designed to survive on their own. They needed synthetic fertilizer to grow. They needed pesticides to survive. What if I tell you that a company that once made Agent Orange, the chemical weapon that was used to destroy the Vietnam people during the war, is today one of the largest suppliers of seeds and agrochemicals in Africa? So billions of dollars is invested in making sure that African farmers are permanently dependent on Western products, Western chemicals. Because at the end of the day, the seeds that are being used here in Africa, they can't sustain themselves. They need chemicals. Between 2000 and 2023, GMO crop adoption in Africa increased by over 400%. Not because African farmers chose it freely, but because policies, many of them written or funded by Western institutions, made it the only viable option for our farmers here in Africa. Our farmers can't operate without these chemicals now. But there was a time here in Africa that we had our own seeds that were capable to be planted until yield without using chemicals. But now our farmers are left with no choice but to use chemicals. Who is supplying those chemicals? Who is supplying Africa right now with seeds? Do we have our own seeds? Now let us talk about the chemicals. Glyphosate, if I'm pronouncing that right, the active ingredient in Monsanto's Roundup herbicide, has been classified as a probable human carcinogen by the World Health Organization. It is banned or severely restricted in France, Germany, Australia, Belgium, and dozens of other European countries. These chemicals that we are using right now in Africa are banned in Europe. Let's think about that a second. Let's get that. Let's try to contemplate that. But it is aggressively marketed in Africa, in Nigeria, in Tanzania, in Zimbabwe. There was a time that paraquat was famous in Zimbabwe. Most of the people that are watching this video, they know what I'm talking about. The chemicals that Europe no longer allows on European soil are being sprayed generously daily into African food. African soil, the food that African children eat. And it's not just seeds and chemicals, it's the food itself. In 1980, Africa was, broadly speaking, food self-sufficient. But today, Africa spends over $45 billion every single year importing food. $45 billion, my people. That is money leaving the continent of Africa every year to buy food. Not just any food, processed food that Africa is more than capable of growing itself. Instant noodles from China, powdered milk from Europe, bleached white flour from America, processed cooking oil from the Southeast Asia, refined sugar. McDonald's, KFC are expanding across the continent at a record speed. And for millions of young Africans, these brands, they represent progress, modernity, success. That is the most dangerous thing they ever sold Africa. Not the food, but the idea that eating like the Western countries means you have arrived. What happens to a body and a continent fed on chemicals? Type 2 diabetes in sub-Saharan Africa has increased by 129% in the last 20 years. Hypertension now affects 46% of adults in Africa. Childhood obesity in urban Africa has more than doubled since 2000. Colorectal cancer, once extraordinarily rare in Africa, is now the fastest growing cancer on the continent. There was a time that in Africa, cancer was very rare. And here is the cruel irony of it all. Africa is copying Western countries in terms of food and way of living, but they are not copying and improving the healthcare system in Africa. And so after these foods causes cancer, diabetes, hypertension, Africa has no capabilities to take care of those who are sick. Once you are diagnosed, you just wait to die. Nothing can be done to help you. In most places in Africa, not all places, not all countries. But after everything has been said, the human body is not the only victim. The land itself is dying. The soil, our soil, African soil. Decades of chemical fertilizer use have systematically destroyed the microbial ecosystems of African soil. The beneficial bacteria, the fungi, the earthworms, the organic matter, all the living intelligence that made African soil legendary is being killed. Year by year, the United Nations estimates that Africa loses 3 to 5 million hectares of fertile land every year to soil degradation. 3 to 5 million hectares, my people. At current rate, several regions of Africa could face complete agricultural collapse within generations. That is your children's children. Chemical runoff from synthetic fertilizers and pesticides has contaminated rivers, lakes, and groundwater across the continent of Africa. In parts of Ghana, the Ashanti region, famously called the Garden of Ghana, rivers that once supported subsistence farming for centuries are now too polluted to irrigate crops. How many African children have grown up being told that traditional food is poor people's food? When you no longer trust your own food, you are no longer free. Let us be specific about who is responsible, because generalizing protects those who are guilty. The Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, was funded primarily by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, two of the most powerful private institutions in the world. Since its founding in 2000, AGRA has invested hundreds of millions of dollars promoting chemical-intensive, high-yield agriculture across Africa. You can go on the internet right now and Google this. A 2020 report evaluating AGRA's impact found that in the 13 countries AGRA targeted, food insecurity actually increased by 30% here in Africa. 30%. After hundreds of millions of dollars in development funding. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have for decades attached conditions to loans given to African governments. Conditions that required those governments to remove or abandon traditional farming and open their markets to imported food. Sometimes the African governments are put in a position to accept these conditions in order to save its people. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented policy positions available in public records right now in World Bank reports. The intent may have been development, but the outcome, my people, was at the end of the day dependence. Across the continent of Africa, quietly something is growing back. The first act of food liberation is reclaiming the seed, our own seeds as African people. Africa is not a helpless continent waiting to be saved. No. We are not waiting to be saved by Western technology. Africa is a continent that built the first cities, wrote the first philosophy, developed the first mathematics, and created food systems so sophisticated while Europe was still in chaos. So much history was never exposed. So much African history was never exposed to the world. Now when these words are spoken, they laugh at us as if we are mad. It was not lack of intelligence that allowed chemical agriculture to colonize African food systems. It was the systematic dismantling of African political, economic, and cultural autonomy. Over 500 years, my people, so that dependence became inevitable. I once interviewed a woman who said, It is a deliberate act to keep Africa in the dark. After watching this video this far, do you think she was telling the truth?